So we are still on Gospel Foundations, Volume 1, Genesis session. We're beginning session 6. So, there we go. I hope you guys had a great time. I hope you're enjoying the stories as they arise and they start getting more interesting as we start getting a little bit more in depth. So, if you're not totally with me on board yet, just give me a few more. Okay, thanks. Let's go. Although God's promises seemed so distant and unbelievable at times, Abraham believed God. This is the single most important statement that marked his life, and yet his biggest test of faith was yet to come. God would indeed make good on his promise to give Abraham a son, and that son, Isaac, would be at the center of that test, the defining moment of his faith. Through this test, we not only see a great demonstration of faith, but also a shadow of God's own sacrifice as a father. Sorry, I got my pen. After long years of waiting, struggles, and doubts, Genesis 17 leaves Abraham with renewed confidence in God's promise of an heir and also a physical sign of the covenant. A reminder of God's faithfulness, circumcision. And yet, the waiting still was not over. One more year would pass between Genesis 17 and 21, where the birth of Isaac is recorded. Abraham had another son, Ishmael, through Hagar. Now, Hagar was his wife's maidservant. But God's promise of offspring would come specifically through Sarah. So his other son is Ishmael. When Abraham was 100 years old, his son through Sarah was finally born. God's long promised blessing of descendants to Abraham was at last visibly being fulfilled in Isaac. And Abraham was faithful to mark this son of the covenant in the way God had commanded him with circumcision, the sign of the covenant. We don't know how old Isaac was when Genesis 22 opens, but it's clear from his interactions with his father that a number of years had gone by. The treasured little boy, Abraham's only son, had grown, and God was about to use him in the greatest test of Abraham's faith. God knew very well what he was asking Abraham to do, to sacrifice the son of promise. In his call, God noted that this was Abraham's only son, Isaac, whom you love. Once again, Abraham proved faithful not only in his obedience to God's command, but in telling the servants, "We'll come back to you." Based on what we see here, Abraham had every intention of sacrificing his son. The knife was raised, but then God intervened and prevented Abraham from following through. While Abraham was spared from sacrificing his son, it's important to notice that the sacrifice was still made. God provided a substitute. Centuries later, God himself would lead his own son up the hill at Calvary, but this time, no substitute for a beloved son would be provided. This time, that son Jesus would be sacrificed as the substitute for the sins of the world. Read in Genesis 22, verses 7 through 14. It tells you all about that sacrifice. Basically, what did happen was that he took his son up, told him they were going to have a sacrifice, didn't tell his son that he was the one, and he tied him up and got ready to kill him, and then, boom, God has a lamb. So sorry. But he has a sacrificial animal right there. but he wanted to see what Abraham was going to do. And he was going to kill his son. These verses help us see the depth of Abraham's faith. Abraham believed that even if he sacrificed Isaac, God would raise him from the dead. He believed God was powerful enough to do this, and also that God would keep his promise to raise up generations of descendants through Isaac. For Abraham, the only reasonable outcome of this puzzling test was resurrection. As Christians, the core of our faith rests on the same thing, that God raises the dead, most specifically that he raised up Jesus, and that one day we will be raised as well. Genesis 22, 1 through 6 will help you with this right here. Here's the sacrifice, the special sacrifice that I was telling you about. In the chapters between the previous session and this one, several situations arose in Abraham's life, including a threat to the fulfillment of God's promise when a king named Abimelech attempted to take Sarah as his wife. But God remained faithful, protected Abraham and Sarah, and miraculously provided a son named Isaac. Isaac was the child of promise. He was the heir through whom the promises would be carried forward. Some years later, however, Abraham's faith was put to the test. God told Abraham to do something that would horrify any father, but especially the father of the promised son, the first descendant of a family through whom the salvation of the world was to come. This was where the rubber would meet the road for Abraham. It's easy to say we trust someone, but the proof of that trust is demonstrated through our acts of obedience. Deep trust revealed in obedience is what we see in this story with Abraham. Here, the covenant-making God tested Abraham's faith by telling him to sacrifice his only son Isaac on one of the mountains in the land of Moriah. That's Moriah. The promise of offspring, as plentiful as the stars, was again in jeopardy as God instructed Abraham to sacrifice his lone descendant. How would you feel if God were to ask you to sacrifice one of your children? It is beyond imagination. We can't process loving and caring for a child, a gift from God, and then hearing God say, go sacrifice your little girl you love on a mountain. For Abraham, though, this command from God affected much more than his family. It presented a cosmic problem. It was not merely a matter of Abraham waiting decades to have a son through Sarah and then being forced to part with the young man. It was even bigger. God's promise to Abraham did not end with that one son. He had promised Abraham offspring as numerous as the stars, and that this offspring would restore the world. The death of Isaac meant the death of this promise of rescuing the world. God's testing us in this way would challenge our faith in him to provide for us. God's testing of Abraham challenged his faith in God to provide salvation for the world. When the time came, in obedient faith, Abraham rose early in the morning, gathered the materials for the sacrifice, and set out for the place where God told him to go. After a 3-day journey, Abraham saw the place and told his servants to remain with the donkey. He said that he and the boy would go over the mountain to worship and that they would return. So Abraham took the wood and laid it on Isaac. He himself carried the fire and the knife, and they set off for the mountain. Abraham demonstrated strong faith in the promises of God. Not only did he intend to sacrifice Isaac, but he also believed that somehow the boy would come away alive on the other side. After all, he told his servants that after the sacrifice was done, we'll come back to you. This is in 22, verse 5. Of course, still in Genesis. He believed that God would keep his promise of offspring, even if it required resurrection from the dead. Abraham and Isaac headed up the mountain for the sacrifice. Abraham did not know exactly what would happen, but he still trusted in the promises of God. And we are right at about 10 minutes. So, I can't wait to read the next one. So stay tuned. I'm gonna post. We'll say this one is session 6 through 8, and I'm gonna start 8. So join me over there so we can hear more about the sacrifice and what